My name is Andy Cullison. I'm an affiliate professor of philosophy here, and I'm also the founding executive director of the Cincinnati Ethics Center, which is also here at University of Cincinnati. There's a few different projects that have been ongoing for me for a while. I'm very interested in, questions in epistemology, particularly questions about epistemic justification and what sorts of things count as evidence. In particular, I'm interested in this thing that we often refer to in our talk when we talk about things seeming true to us. We use that talk all the time. And it's not really clear what the heck a seeming is. So I'm really interested in the metaphysical question, what are these things? And then I'm also interested in the epistemological question, do they have any justificatory force or not, so to speak? That's one. I also do some work in philosophy of religion. I'm really interested in questions about the problem of evil, problem of divine hiddenness. And then I'm also interested in other kinds of meta-ethical questions about, are there moral facts or not, or are these things that are just made up? Those are probably, I'd say, three kind of core things that I'm interested in. But I'm also getting more interested in some other more applied epistemology and applied ethics things as well. So one I'll be brief on, it's Michael Huemer's, Skepticism in the Veil of Perception. He's the one that's sort of credited with sort of kickstarting what a lot of what we might call epistemic internalists are talking quite a bit about now, which is that question about seemings. What are they? And can they have any justificatory force, so to speak? Can they justify beliefs? And that was the book that I took a seminar on internalism, externalism debates, and that was one of the books that my soon-to-be dissertation advisor had us read. And that actually was that was the basis for my entire dissertation and much of my research program for the last 15 years or so. Another work I really like, though, is David Lewis's On the Plurality of Worlds. Not so much for what it is he concludes in that, which is that he's a concrete modal realist. He thinks for any way the world could be, there's a concrete world that is that way. And a lot of people think that's just a metaphysically extravagant view. But what I admire about the book is the methodological take. It's a good paradigm example of a kind of philosophical methodology that I really like, which is look, let me help myself to this one thing, and I'll solve all these other philosophical problems for you. So that it's just a really, really interesting way that he goes about arguing for that. So I borrow that methodology in some of my own work related to this thing that I'm talking about with seemings. So there's actually a few different side interests. I've been very interested in social epistemology. The traditional epistemology is a lot about, questions about how individuals can know things and how individuals can be justified in believing things. And social epistemology actually sort of blows that up to thinking about interesting philosophical questions about knowledge in the context of groups of people or systems. And so it's a weird mishmash of, it feels like you're doing a little bit of ethics and political philosophy, but you're also still drawing on the tools of traditional epistemology. So a bunch of interesting things there about reasonable disagreement, testimony, misinformation, whether or not AI can be knowledge producing or not. And so that's one area. I'm also interested in some applied ethics issues related to what you might call taboos, so to speak. So for example, I'm interested in questions about the ethics of teasing people, ethics of comedy more generally. There's some contemporary philosophers that are doing a lot of really cool, interesting work there. But broader, I'm also interested in, one kind of taboo is teasing in inappropriate ways. And we seem to have a clear sense that sometimes it's okay and sometimes it's not. But it's real hard to actually say what makes it okay and what makes it not. But there's other kinds of taboos, like using bad words, right? We have these strong feelings that there are certain words that we should just never use. And then we also have this idea, but some of the words that we should never use, in some contexts, it's okay to use them. And I'm kind of interested in that question as well. And I actually think there is a connection between the two. I'm starting to think that these taboos serve actually a kind of important social function, particularly as it comes to relationships between people. So that's a thing that I'm really interested in. I think there's a few ways in which it has implications. I'll do an epistemology example and then I'll do an ethics example. So, epistemology example, you sometimes see a lot of, I guess, what you might think of as certain ways of thinking philosophically about knowledge and evidence in the public sphere that I think is a little bit uncareful and imprecise. I see this in politics all the time where people deploy what we might in philosophy regard as very naive, implausible, skeptical type arguments, like the like sort of possibility of error arguments, where they challenge an assumption from a political opponent, for example, by just saying, well, you don't know that. For all you know, this could be the case, right? But that's like the worst kind of skeptical argument. Like in an epistemology classroom, we usually like dismiss that one right away and then start focusing on skeptical arguments that are a little bit more plausible and have a little bit more, I think, reason for us to be concerned. So I think, there are things that are the outcomes of thinking through some of these epistemological questions that, like, if more people were thinking about them clearly in the, as they like to say, the real world, right? I don't think we'd be as prone to buying some of these tactics and moves made. So there's an epistemology type one. On the ethics side of things, a lot of what I do is thinking about moral reasoning developing moral reasoning skills. Our ethics center does a lot of that work. When I started doing this work about 8 years ago, it was surprising to me that they had already done a lot of these studies on people's moral reasoning abilities and how those skills translate into other kinds of skills that we care about outside of philosophy. So, for example, when people are better at moral reasoning, you actually see them assess as being more effective leaders or exhibiting traits and behaviors that we look for in effective leadership. So there's a lot of interesting data that the stuff we're doing here in philosophy and ethics is actually translating into some things that a lot of people outside of philosophy care deeply about and spend an enormous amount of money trying to figure out. And it turns out some of the things we do in philosophy can solve those problems for them. So the Cincinnati Ethics Center was founded in January 2022. So we just celebrated our second year anniversary back in January. One way to think about the mission is we're basically doing what we might call ethics education, or construed as moral reasoning development. And I also tack in leadership development from what you might think of as wonder years to golden years. So we do a lot of K through 12 moral reasoning development. So we're working very closely with the high schools. There's a lot of opportunity to do really publicly engaged philosophy for students who come to UC. We also do a lot of workshops internally for faculty, staff, and students at UC. And we're also starting to work with organizations, trying to do some of this work as sort of almost like professional development, but centered around moral reasoning development and ethics education type activities. UC has an ethics bowl team, a collegiate ethics bowl team, for those of you familiar with ethics bowl. And we hire a graduate assistant to serve as a coach. And we're switching the model up a little bit for the fall, but we make that a class that undergrads can take multiple times. And so that's one graduate assistantship opportunity. I also am on the board for the American Philosophical Association and am the secretary treasurer of the Eastern Division. And one of my jobs is to plan the large Eastern Division conference. And that comes with funding to hire somebody to assist with the planning of that conference. So there's also a graduate assistantship related to having someone assist with that. And then both of those graduate assistantships will also have some opportunities to do some of that publicly engaged work, getting into the K through 12 classrooms, helping with Ethics Bowl, helping with some of our youth programs at the libraries as well. There's a lot of things that are special about this department. One thing I've noticed, and I hope I don't offend any of my colleagues at other institutions where I worked, but this is a very, very friendly department, a very friendly department. I'm sure there are tensions that I'm unaware of, as there might be in any department, but as far as I can tell, this is just, everybody's really, really friendly. And you can also see a deep level of commitment to the graduate education experience. At other PhD programs that I've observed or visited, the professors are very focused on their research, and it's not always a guarantee that they're going to be there willing and ready to work closely with you. And all I hear about are like how many meetings graduate students are having with their advisors. The professors here seem to have a commitment to graduate education that is similar to what you would expect a professor at a small liberal arts college to have toward their undergrads. It seems very open door, and everybody seems very accessible. And I think that's really special. You know, when I advise my undergraduate students on picking programs, I ask them to look for a couple of things. One, try to go and visit and try to spend time talking not just to the professors, but to the graduate students. When I was a prospective graduate student, I went to their prospective student day, and I spent an enormous amount of time talking to the graduate students. And one thing I didn't realize at the time was, when I decided to go where I went, I kind of lucked out that it was a really good cohort of graduate students, and they were always around talking to each other. They were always, hanging out and talking about their ideas. And most of my philosophical education probably happened as much in those interactions with the graduate students than it did with my professors and my dissertation advisor. I spent more time talking philosophy with the graduate students than the professors, just because of the nature of our lifestyles and things like that. And so who the students you're going to be surrounded with, I think, does matter to the experience. And one thing I can say, just having observed, I've been here 2 years now, having observed, this does seem like a collegial graduate student life. Like the graduate students are always around whenever I'm walking through the department. They always seem to be talking to each other about philosophy, but it would be worth taking time to figure out that. There's another thing, of course, you do want to figure out if there are people whom you think would be good to work with. Somebody in this department is going to be your dissertation director. So also coming and visiting and spending time talking to the professors about their interests, about what your interests are, just figuring out if you have a kind of, rapport with them is important. And then third, the pragmatic thing is looking at placement records, right? I mean, I assume you're going to be getting a degree to also go get a job as a philosopher teaching, and it's worth exploring that. And UC, to my understanding, has a pretty dang good placement record. Well, fun fact, I home brew beer, and I almost started a brewery back in the day. I think that would be kind of fun to start a brewery. Or, I like nonprofit work. I'd probably be, trying to work in the nonprofit sector in some way, shape, or form. One of those two options.